I'm Sharon Moen, the Communications Coordinator at the University of Minnesota Sea Grant program. I'd like to introduce you to Athelstan Spilhaus, a visionary scientist, urban theorist, and the father of Sea Grant. Spilhaus was described by Walter Cronkite as the most interesting person he had ever interviewed, an opinion which, as evidenced by his life and times, I believe to be true. In this presentation, I'll share why. Before I begin, I have a question for you. How do you want the world to be different because you lived in it? From my perspective, in addition to passing on some historical insights, this question is the point of sharing Spilhaus's life with you. Using Spilly's unconventional personality and notable contributions to science and the United States, I intend to illustrate how an individual's successes and failures, passions and ambitions can outlast life itself. When I was approached about writing Dr. Spilhaus's biography, I only had the vaguest of notions that Spilhaus was an oceanographer that somehow became misplaced in Minnesota. Since then, I've become keenly aware of what many others grasped before me and what a generation could be poised to forget. Spilhaus was a genius. Back in the day, he was called the ocean community's Michelangelo, or the flywheel of the machine of American science. Spilhaus was colorful, sharp-thinking, and intensely productive. And like you, he was once a baby. Success is more likely when both nature and nurture are on your side. Athel's life no doubt took some of the turns it did because he had the good fortune of being born into a family that valued intellectual and practical pursuits. His parents weren't quite as outrageous as he was, but they sure set a sprightly pace towards an unconventional life. Athel was born in South Africa in 1911 and ran barefooted through the streets there and over the fields, at least half the time chased by perturbed governesses. Aside from being the baby of the family, the child that would have closed the age gap between Athel and his younger sister died. Athel's mother, Nellie, was one of the first, if not the first, woman to graduate from the University of Cape Town. At least in part, this must be because her father was Sir Thomas Muir, a world-famous mathematician. Sir Thomas presided over the education system in the Cape. Now, Nellie was also one of the first women in South Africa to enter politics, devoting herself to the rights of women and colored people. Athel likely developed his intellectual curiosity and his ideas about resources and not wasting them from his Scottish mother. Athel's father, Carlos, was orphaned in infancy. He left Germany to go to South Africa when he was 19 and became a brilliantly successful businessman. After the family's exile to the hinterlands of South Africa during World War I, Dad was a German after all, Carlos, a charismatic man inclined to a bit of bombast, was appointed trade commissioner to Europe. Because of this appointment, Athel went to school for the first time ever at an English boarding school. He was 10 years old. 6 years later, back in South Africa, Athel captured the attention of the media for the first time by sailing across salt flats in a sand yacht he and his buddy Archie made out of an old automobile frame. I'm including this vignette because it foreshadows Spilly's lifelong devotion to the sea, invention, and the press. Armed with an undergraduate degree in engineering from the University of Cape Town, Athel apprenticed with engineers on merchant ships. But all the while he was captivated by airplanes. Africa's vastness and rudimentary road systems suggested to him that air travel would make the continent accessible. He wound up in Germany, helping to make airplanes until the Third Reich's growing power made him uncomfortable. Pondering what to do next, he decided to go to graduate school at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now get this. On arriving at MIT, Athel lugged his bags to the admissions office and asked to see the dean. Despite the lack of an application backed by transcripts, recommendations, and test scores, Athel managed to charm his way into MIT. Drive and intelligence weren't enough to put him through that master's degree, however. Whiskey helped. Ironically, Athel needed a boat to pay for his studies in flight. Along with some university mates, Athel gathered cases of scotch and other whiskeys that had been pitched into the ocean off of Cape Cod. They rounded up the flotsam and sailed the illegal cargo to a beach. Legitimate money came by way of the air mass indicator, Athel's first patented invention. It measured relative humidity and temperature, and the position at which the needles of the two gauges crossed marked how comfortable a room might feel. The comfort meter, as it was also called, indicated if the condition of a room was raw, muggy, dry, or keen. An air conditioning company purchased the rights. Athel thought that was the last anyone would hear of that indicator. But, as it turns out, today you can purchase a comfort meter, a device similar to Athel's design, for about $90. Athel thoroughly enjoyed being a student at MIT. He shared a room and some co-authorships with Charles Stark Draper, a man who went on to invent the guidance system that enabled the Apollo space program. Athel realized that aircraft were especially affected by weather's whims, so he sought to learn as much as he could about weather patterns. Some of that learning happened in South Africa, where he whisked his Bostonian bride, Mary Atkins. The year they spent there included his military stint destroying Dud artillery shells left over from the Boer War, which gave him access to airplanes. With these airplanes, he made the first routine upper air ascents to gather meteorological measurements in the southern hemisphere, ever. We went up without oxygen to about 16,000 feet in biplanes, he said. We tried to get to 18,000 feet without our little meteorograph attached to the wing. When we began to black out, we would dive to breathe. Well, as much fun as blacking out at high altitudes must have been, Athel missed academia. He cabled one of his old professors, who arranged a position with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Athel and Mary's exodus from Africa began with a Buick Roadster, a compass, and an adventurous scheme to drive a mostly roadless path from Cape Town to Alexandria, Egypt. As Dr. Robert Abel, the first National Sea Grant director, said, the story of their trip would make science fiction look commonplace. Spanning marketplaces and mountaintops, the couple dared a journey that covered well over 5,000 miles of rugged terrain, which Athel and Mary mapped by altitude. During the mostly off-road road trip, Athelstan noted how the pitch of roofs changed in relation to wind and the rain. These observations surfaced multiple times in his later writings about societies and city design. The trip led them beside the gray-green, greasy Limpopo River, immortalized by Rudyard Kipling, a family friend. It led them to pygmy tribes, to merchants selling human flesh, and past the great temple before it was moved. Athel re-entered the world of research through the door created by Dr. Carl Rossby, who was a brilliant physicist, meteorology pioneer, and a very unusual character in his own right. Spilhaus and Rossby had notable similarities, including a flair for showmanship and a flamboyance that is rare among scientists. As a research assistant connected with Rossby, Athel's biggest coup was inventing the Bathythermograph, or BT. Rossby wanted to understand how wind and currents shunted warm Gulf Stream water towards Massachusetts' coast. Realizing that they couldn't properly study eddies without a rapid way to measure temperature, Rossby challenged Athel to use his engineering skills. Athel's laboratory was the men's bathroom in the cellar of the mechanical engineering building. He said, "These were not the plush days of research. We just did with what we had. I was delighted to get it, as the power, plumbing, and drains were all in. The basement bathroom seems more likely a place to be experimenting with mold and cockroaches, but this is where the Bathythermograph, an instrument that would become consequential for research as well as war, was conceived." The BT was the first device ever to continuously record both temperature and pressure, which was a proxy for depth. As it descended through the ocean, it traced the water's temperature-pressure profile on a microscope slide smoked with skunk oil. 3 patents and a stack of professional publications later, Spilhaus and Rossby had used the BT to describe ocean secrets such as vertical temperature structures, lateral mixing, and large eddies at the edge of the Gulf Stream. They also helped Navy engineers figure out why they kept missing their submarine targets. Athel recalled that they used the BT to show that it was the thermal layering of oceans and the thermocline that were responsible for bending the sonar pings. When Athel was a mere 26 years old, he was recruited from the lavatory to found and chair the meteorology department at New York University. Spilly became one of the youngest faculty members to be given a full professorship at a major university, and he earned it with balloons, flares, cameras, and a brash approach to weather forecasting. Within the year, he had developed his own methods of charting night winds and started describing the ozone content of New York City air. As the NYU department grew, the Spilhaus family grew too, with the birth of Athelstan Frederick Jr., Fred, in 1938. Molly, Nellie, Margaret Ann, and Carl were also born to Mary and Athel, though not until the 1940s. The 1940s also encompassed World War II. Still a citizen of South Africa, a special wartime act of Congress allowed Athel to join the U.S. military. Mostly, the lieutenant colonel worked on weather-related operations from New Jersey, but in 1945, Athel was literally living in a cave in northern China, just a stone's throw away from Mao Zedong's cave. He grew to admire Mao while he was establishing covert weather stations and reporting weather to U.S. bombers from behind Japanese enemy lines. For his wartime contributions, Chiang Kai-shek's army put a $20,000 dead or alive bounty on Athel's head, and the U.S. Army put a Legion of Merit pin on his chest. Athel became a U.S. citizen when he returned from World War II, and he also resumed his post at NYU without realizing how important BTs had become as anti-submarine technology. It turns out that bathythermographs became so important that Winston Churchill himself wrote Athel a letter thanking him for inventing them. Thousands of BTs were manufactured during World War II. The patent he filed made him a man of means. Athel was never one to rest on his laurels, though. Post-war, Athel and his NYU colleagues were investigating ways to fly balloons across the Atlantic to study the atmosphere. Among the curious balloon projects Athel became involved with during his mid-30s, one begat enough fodder for UFO enthusiasts to be chewing on today. Here's what really happened in Roswell in 1947. The debris found by a rancher in New Mexico were the remains of a highly classified, high-altitude balloon experiment headed by Athel. The super-secret Project Mogul was inspired by the World War II discovery that explosions could be heard thousands of miles away with underwater microphones placed in the ocean's deep sound channels. Since the ocean and air share similar attributes, it was thought that there might be a region in the upper atmosphere that could conduct sound in a similar way. As there were no satellites at this point in history, and few ways to know if the Soviets were testing atomic weaponry, the NYU's balloons were to keep a steady altitude high in the atmosphere while carrying equipment for detecting sound waves generated by Soviet nuclear detonations and ballistic missiles. There was a cover-up, but not because alien bodies lay among the debris. Mogul was top secret, and the downed high-altitude balloon almost blew its cover. Cost, security, and practicality eventually led to the disbandment of Mogul. However, the project laid a foundation for a comprehensive program in geophysical research. Now, before Mogul ended, President Truman asked Spilly to take a 6-month leave from balloons and NYU to go back to South Africa to help reorganize the country's meteorological service. While they're helping to make weather predictions more effective and efficient, Athel obtained a doctoral degree in Oceanography from the University of Cape Town. The ink on his PhD barely had a chance to dry before Athel was recruited to be the dean of the University of Minnesota's Institute of Technology. Athel's leadership style was hands-off, and he could hardly sit through department meetings. When Athel's professional role changed from detector to dean, his publications changed along with it. Where before he explored the air and water to find new facts, now he probed them for their usefulness to humanity. With confidence bordering on arrogance, Athel issued directives for approaching the environment, including climate, with a logical sequence of stages involving observations, understanding, prediction, and ultimately control. Maybe Athel's impatience with the University of Minnesota staff meetings stemmed from his participation on more than 60 boards, committees, and commissions. The rewards for spreading his attention so thinly were the ego-stroking envy of his peers and access to logistically difficult destinations, like the South Pole and the other side of the Iron Curtain. His worldliness established his local cachet, making it possible for some of his ideas to take root. For example, it's possible to stroll along the skyways in downtown Minneapolis because he convinced politicians and urban planners that such engineering feats would foster economic activity. One of the more pivotal boards Athel served on was the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization Executive Board. Although he didn't hold UNESCO in high regard, the dean agreed to be Eisenhower's first official U.S. representative because he wanted to offset Russian propaganda associated with the Cold War. Several of the 16 leaves of absences the dean took while at the University of Minnesota involved the atomic testing grounds in Nevada and New Mexico. Athel bore witness to atomic bomb tests as the scientific director of weapons effects, for which he was awarded the Exceptional Civilian Service Medal by the U.S. Air Force. Despite his eagerness for advances in science, Athel was disturbed by the haste at which some advances were occurring. He said, "By sending a bomb or a dog to the moon, I fear we will contaminate it with radioactivity or fleas before we even know what it's like." While Athel's concerns were valid, modern chemists use the bomb spike as a defining point in commenting on our planet's history. The bomb that set Athel off, however, was called Sputnik. In 1955, Athel and several other men announced the U.S. intended to put the world's first satellite into space for the International Geophysical Year. After the U.S. announced its intentions to launch a satellite, military branches bickered over the project's ownership, which gave Soviet scientists and engineers an opportunity to preempt America's efforts. Sputnik's surprise launch in 1957 destabilized the U.S.'s conviction of its own scientific prowess, which vaulted the nation into a frenzy of activity and ambition. Athel was infuriated. Russia's underhandedness sent Spilly into such a rage that he did the only natural thing. He decided to moonlight as a comic strip author. Our New Age was his personal crusade to ignite scientific fervor in the U.S. Within 2 years, the strip ran in over 100 American newspapers and 19 foreign ones. Athel wore out 3 artists in 15 years. He treated the Science Applied to the Future strips as a hobby. Deadlines were demanding and sometimes daunting, especially in 1962 when he created the comic on a daily basis. Dr. Spilhaus told a Times Magazine reporter, "I love to try something I don't know how to do and then damn well do it." At that time, he was also taking up trap drumming, abstract painting, and learning about business. "I don't do so many things," he said. "I do one. I think about the future." The future was certainly one of the things he was thinking about when President Kennedy asked Athel for a favor. He asked if he would leave the University of Minnesota for a year to salvage the U.S. science exhibit at the Seattle's World's Fair. When Seattle's civic leaders began planning the World's Fair in the mid-50s, they imagined a festival of the West. However, given Sputnik and the ensuing space race, the fair became a vehicle for showcasing the United States' science and space technologies. He claimed in retrospect that it was great fun, probably because Athel's position on the board of the American Association for the Advancement of Science ensured that first-rate scientists and artists labored side by side in a creative frenzy to make the fair and its science exhibit breathtakingly phenomenal. After the fair ended, Athel asked President Kennedy, "Why did you pick on me?" Kennedy responded, "The only science I know, Spilly, is what I read in the Boston Globe in your comic strip." By the end of the World's Fair, Athel, who was 50, was professionally successful, but his marriage was foundering. Retrospectively admitting to hubris in a post-fair midlife crisis, when he returned to Minneapolis, he divorced Mary and wed Gail Thompson, a chic Seattle businesswoman. Incredibly, while going through a divorce, acquiring a new bride, writing a daily comic strip, and more, Athel also inadvertently and somewhat carelessly lobbed an idea that would commandeer vast quantities of his time and energy. That idea was Sea Grant. He said, "Oceans are not a dry subject," and he really meant it, and thought it and wrote it and spoke about oceans on such a regular basis that Lloyd Smith, a professor at the University of Minnesota and chair of the American Fisheries Society conference program, invited him to give a keynote address at the annual meeting of the society in 1963 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. After living the fair life in Seattle, Athel was cavalier. He said, "I fell for a very short time into the error of thinking, 'Oh hell, I'm such a good speaker. I don't have to prepare this thing. I'll just do it off the cuff.' There I was, quite literally going from my home in a taxi thinking, 'What will I tell these people on a boring subject, an age-old one? How do we get the government, industry, and the universities to cooperate?' And suddenly I thought, here's the University of Minnesota, a land-grant institution. Once that went through my mind, I thought, what the hell? That's the way to do it for the sea." Well, that day, Athel riveted the fisheries managers and researchers in the room. He spoke with an outrage that resonated with his audience about how Peruvian ships outfished all other nations. Athel said that similar to land-grant's grassroots efforts, they could create an eel grassroots effort for the sea. Spilly did not expect much to become of his address, but then letters began arriving. One of those letters Dr. Spilhaus received was from a professor at the University of Rhode Island. Athel wrote back suggesting that the ocean state could pioneer the Sea Grant concept. A copy of the letter went to Dr. John Knaus, then the dean of the Graduate School of Oceanography. Dr. Canals shared the idea with Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell, who then championed the idea on Capitol Hill. In the 3 years and 33 days spanning the moment Athel launched the Sea Grant concept and the program's federal authorization, the energetic professor wrote an impressive number of letters and articles and went on a lecturing rampage to drum up enthusiasm for the National Sea Grant program. Athel spun a vision of the Sea Grant colleges as institutions that would concentrate on applied science, like prospecting underwater, cultivating sea vegetables, aquaculture, discovering marine medicine, and manipulating climate. Later he wrote, "I wanted an exact parallel with land-grant colleges, and I wanted the colleges who participated to be given, in perpetuity, reserved bits of the seashore and waters out to the territorial limits." Canals did not think Spilhaus was the easiest person to work with. He said cautiously, "I agreed with him more than I disagreed. He did not have much tolerance for fuzzy ideas, or negotiating, or trying to reach some kind of consensus. He was impatient, even with bright men who were discussing matters." At the same time Athel was stumping for Sea Grant, he was pushing for an experimental city to be built. Inspired by all that he had seen and discussed with futurists and architects during the World's Fair, Spilly began envisioning experimental cities that would not create waste. He abhorred the idea of waste, seeing it as something we just haven't been creative enough to use. MXC was the Minnesota Experimental City, planned and almost built in Aiken County, Minnesota. MXC was to be one mighty research laboratory where scientific inquiries and prototypes and technocrats were sovereign. The 250,000 people living there would inhabit an archetype of a city. The technologies developed and tested in northern Minnesota would attract an international market that would bolster the U.S. economy and scientific prowess. The grandiose idea almost materialized with the input of Buckminster Fuller and some wealthy and powerful business allies and well-connected politicians. What killed MXC and why you can't visit it today is because the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and citizens groups made building it impossible. Such impossibilities left Athel with a sour taste for what he called ecomaniacs and drove him to push for building sea cities, less practical, but more likely to escape the surge of environmental legislation. The 54-year-old Dr. Spilhaus stepped down as the Dean of Institute of Technology at the University of Minnesota in 1966, having evolved from a research scientist to a public spokesperson for technology, experimental cities, and Sea Grant. A short blurb in the St. Paul Pioneer Press indicated that he had resigned to become sort of a scientific gadfly. There are many adventures I could talk about here, including how Spilly helped a school district in Florida to racially integrate, but the one I find most intriguing is the sculpture he designed for New York City. The next time you're in New York City, I encourage you to go to Rockefeller Center and see Spilly's artwork. It's standing outside the McGraw-Hill building. Athel claims ennui was setting in when an architect who had visited the World's Fair in Seattle called to ask if he was interested in helping to create a public space that had a scientific twist. Thus, the Plaza of the Solar System was born. The triangle of the sun, the focal point of the plaza, is the remaining part you can see today. The 20-ton stainless steel triangle towers 65 feet above the pavement. Its mirrored surfaces reflect the pattern of the surrounding skyscrapers, but more importantly, the triangle marks the position of the sun in the sky at the solstices and the equinoxes. What you can't see anymore is the pool representing the sun. It could be lit, and swirling water gave the illusion of sunspots. The pool was edged with mirrored stainless steel spheres representing the planets. Athel recounted that one day he received a frantic call from the McGraw-Hill building people saying, "Somebody has stolen the Earth," which was about the size of a baseball. When the company asked what they should do about it, Athel answered, "Pay the money to replace it. After all, you can charge it off to publicity. It's the first instance of cosmic larceny." Athel said they laughed like hell and replaced it. In the 70s, while all this was going on, Robert White, the first ever administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, offered Athel the chief scientist position at the agency. Athel declined, but after some cajoling, White convinced Athel to become his special assistant for 3 days a week. When Gale passed away in 1978, Athel was bereft, but not bankrupt of ideas. Misuse of maps bothered him since childhood. Athel understood that a single ocean covers nearly 3/4 of the Earth, and that maps emphasizing land were next to useless for showing the way winds and currents move. He published the first world map showing oceans the way he truly favored them being shown in 1983. He called it "My Ultimate Map of the Oceans." In Spilly's Atlas, published by the American Philosophical Society, he created maps with edges that relied on geophysical features like shorelines or tectonic plates. Land masses were scaled proportionately, and the aspect was chosen to show off some point about our Earth. He said, "Aspect is the choice of what the artist wants the viewer to see. It's what puts art in cartography." Athel claimed he had finished his mapping of the Earth 2 days before he died. He told Kathy, his third wife, as he went to bed that night, "The world map is perfected. I've been working on it since 1942. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that Athel, father of Sea Grant, flywheel of the machine of American science, was an avid collector of mechanical toys. He and Kathy had the largest private collection in the United States, numbering about 4,000 toys at its best. In fact, he and Kathy added on a climate-controlled addition to their home in order to house the collection. The world lost a remarkable man in 1998. Athel's ashes are buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Well, about half of them are. With help from Louise O'Connor, Kathy Spilhaus scattered about a quarter of the remaining ashes in the Gulf Current, honoring the importance of his days with Rosby at MIT. She gave the rest to the sea at the 20th meridian east, where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic, off the tip of South Africa. If there were a question about where Athelstan's heart lay, the atmosphere, the ocean, or the future, the question was answered through his death. In lieu of flowers, the family requested that mourners make contributions to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Willard Bascom, a leader in the early days of deep-sea exploration and a friend of Athel's, said, "Athel's greatest achievement was persuading many people that science is fun and that oceanography encompasses many branches of science." Athelstan Spilhaus made the world different because he lived in it. My parting challenge to you is to astound yourselves with your own creativity, energy, and ideas. Ask yourself often, how do you want the world to be different because you lived in it? Minnesota Sea Grant is a University of Minnesota system-wide program anchored at the Duluth campus. It is one of 33 Sea Grant programs funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which supports economic and ecological stability in coastal regions through applied science. Find out more at www.seagrant.umn.edu.